Well, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Arman, and I'm a member of SPC. We're really excited to have Tom Steyer here today. For those of you who aren't familiar with his illustrious career, it basically is everything under the sun, from starting a very successful hedge fund to starting one of the largest environmental nonprofits. And as many of you know, he did run for president in 2020. So we're really excited to have him here today. But first, I'd love to share a little bit more about South Park Commons, of which I'm a member. South Park Commons is a home for technologists, builders, and domain experts looking for what they want to do next. It's more than the physical space you see here, but truly a diverse community of folks who are intent on setting up their peers for success. Our community programming includes learning forums, builder squads, and speaker events. So if you're interested, go to southparkcommons.com. So back to Tom. After working at places like Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, Tom started his own hedge fund in 1986 called Farallon Capital. It was one of the most successful, it is still one of the most successful hedge funds and is known for managing university endowments. Tom also became really active in climate change and climate justice while I was at Farallon. He, both in California and nationally, for example, he was known as one of the biggest opponents of the Keystone XL pipeline. Tom left Farallon in 2012 to pursue his climate activism full time. He founded Next Gen America, a leading nonprofit where the goal was to really activate youth around climate justice. He also ran for the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination on a very progressive platform, including a global Green New Deal fund. And finally, last year he founded Galvanize Climate Solutions, an investment platform that intends to transition us to a decarbonized society. So we're thrilled to have Tom here today and to talk to him a little bit about opportunities in climate tech. I'm going to ask him some of your top questions and then open it up for an off-the-record Q&A, which I promised will be a little bit spicy. But first, Tom will give us an overview of climate today and why this is such an important time to be building in climate tech.
Thanks, Arman. Well, let's start with the problem. I mean, when you think about solutions, it's nice to try to understand what the problem is. Basically, the temperature has gone up about 1.2 C since pre-industrial, which means nothing to 99% of Americans because we don't think in Celsius. So it's completely ridiculous. I would say, to put that in context, the UN, which has taken upon itself to be the arbiter of what is safe or unsafe in climate, is saying that if we can keep it below 1.5 C, that is considered safe. If we get to 2 C, that's considered extraordinarily dangerous, and anything beyond that is, really out of control. What I would say is this: that is not the right way to think about this, even though that is what every single description of this dwells on, which is a simple relationship between greenhouse gas emissions and air temperature. That is, and it's a pretty straightforward arithmetic relationship, the way it's described in the press virtually all the time. I think the right way to think about this is that relationship will hold, and those descriptions are meaningful until they're not. And the reason that they would not be is we will disturb the rest of the planet in a way that then puts us on a completely different trajectory. And there are a bunch of different ways that can happen. The most obvious one is that at some point, if we melt the tundra, it holds, I think, 8 times the amount of greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere. And so if that in fact happens, we will be in a different place. And that whole idea of how much we emit and in relationship to the temperature, that simple relationship will be completely gone. So I think the right way to think about this is partly that there are tipping points here that we don't exactly understand and are not in the models in any meaningful way, which can put us in a different place. That's one thing that I think we should think is different. And the second thing I think is different is that the scientists have, if you think about what they thought would happen in 2000, if this is the good end and this is the bad end, in terms of emissions and temperature, we've always been here. But it's been in the range. It's been at the worst end of the range, but it's really been in the predictable range. What has been completely different, if you go back 22 years to 2000 to see what the UN is saying, is they were basically saying in 2000, if we go to 6 degrees C, we are really screwed. And then in 2008, they were saying, if we go to 4 degrees C, we are really screwed. And it's just marched down, because what we've seen is that the impact on the planet and the impact on humans and other species on this planet have been so much dramatically worse than we would have predicted at various temperatures. So when you look at this summer and you look at what's going on in the West here, you look at what's going on in Europe, you look at what's going on in China, you look at what's going on in India, and you think about the impacts, and then that's at 1.2 C versus the 6 C that scientists were saying 22 years ago would be a real problem for us. And you realize that's really a gigantic change in terms of what we can deal with. So the first thing is that's the problem. The second point is we actually are in much better position now to solve this problem than we've ever been. And that's for a variety of reasons. Partly is the work that's been done so that we can do it without gigantic economic disruption. You know, the cost of so many of the clean technologies has moved so much, continues to move. And that's a process sitting in Northern California that we can all feel like, you know, we understand how those things work, that technology gets better, that people are smart, that in fact we can get things done that seem, you know, really preposterously difficult and then 10 years later seem like really obvious. So that's one thing that's changed. The policies have changed. I mean, I breathed a gigantic sigh of relief about the Inflation Reduction Act. But I think around the world, the difference in terms of where policymakers were 10 years ago and now is really dramatic. I think consumers are different in terms of what they both say and are willing to do, which of course are not the same things. The money's really different. You know, if you look at the United States, you know, people will say that there's 48 times more money going into, that is dedicated to some form of ESG than there was 5 years ago, and that's true. But if you look at the US versus Europe on this, 10% of money in the United States by dollars says, you know, I want to have some form of environmental climate overlay to where you invest my money, 10%. In Europe, it's 90%. In Europe, at Deutsche Bank, which is kind of the national bank of Germany, if you come in to open up an account, they assume you want an environmental overlay unless you tell them you don't. That's a huge change. So money has changed. Companies have changed. You know, living here in the United States, you can see the dramatic about face of General Motors, JP Morgan. You know, General Motors was suing California for having too severe miles per gallon rules in 2019 or 2020. And now they say they're going to be 100% EVs. That's a 180. So that's really changed. And I think also looking at you, which by and large are not my generation, young people understand this problem differentially. Young people are turning out to work in these areas differentially, and that's a dramatic change. So if you talk to people who are looking at what is generally called clean tech 1.0, like around 2008, 2010, the quality of entrepreneur now, the quality of people going into the companies, the number of people who are focused on this problem writ large is much higher, much bigger number, and, you know, really incredible people. And that is a big change, because if you want to solve a problem and you're going to do it through human capital and brain power, then you'd like to have a lot of brains and hopefully very big ones. So that's a big change too. So we're in a position to do this that has never existed before to solve it, but I think we have a better sense of how big this problem is and how tough it is. And I think that people had certainly dramatically underestimated the impact. And I think, you know, I view it as to avoid unlimited human suffering. That's the goal. And that's why I've always been so wound up about it, because and the other rule about this is, the more innocent you are, the more you will suffer. And that's true in the United States, and that's really true around the world. And that is a huge deal in terms of thinking about how we're going to solve this, what is essentially a human-caused problem. How are humans going to solve this problem? We're going to have to take into account the human aspects of it.
Yeah. Preventing unconditional or unlimited human suffering sounds like a very important problem to solve. I'm curious, I think your first point focused kind of on how temperature change isn't necessarily a sufficient metric on which to measure how we are combating climate change. Do you have alternate frameworks or ways to think about it that are as easy or clear for folks who might not be as invested or as involved in climate right now?
Well, I think the point about tipping points is that they're very hard to put into a computer program. And what we've seen is, in my mind, a shocking inability for people to wrap their minds around the idea that things change dramatically. So I'll give you an example of this. And I think the actual answer is, you don't know when you're going to hit a point that's irrecoverable. So you need to stay away from it. It's not like we can see the wall right there, so we know if we can just stop an inch from that wall, we're going to be okay. If you think about the Amazon for 1 second, which is a tipping point, I think the right way to think about the Amazon, it is its own climate, and it's a big sequester of carbon. And if you think about it like a big greenhouse. So it has its own climate within it, covered in. But as you cut down the Amazon, it's like putting holes in the greenhouse walls so that the air comes in from the outside, so it loses the ability to be its own environment. Basically, people think that if you cut down 20 to 22%, then you start to turn it from being a carbon sink into being a carbon emitter. And that ultimately it turns it into a savanna, a grassland. Well, we're at 19%. So do we really know it's 20%? Do we know it's 22%? We don't know, because we've never really had a chance to see. It's people making guesses. So my point is, if you really think you're going to burn down your whole house, you don't want to get close to that. And so the biggest point is, this is not a system we understand or can model, because it's the Earth, and that's more complicated than anybody's computer program. And to give you an example of how off this can be in my mind. So I looked up yesterday, because I was in a difficult mood, what people thought the impact would be on the world's GDP in 2100 if we didn't do anything about climate. And the consensus view from the UN was that if we didn't do anything about climate, the temperature would be 4 degrees C hotter, and it would hit GDP by 7%. So that would be 93% of what it otherwise would be. Not the end of the world by any stretch of the imagination, which in my mind is completely absurd. Completely absurd. If you think about 7.2 degrees hotter and what that would mean in terms of, first of all, it can't happen, because then you've melted the tundra. So you're just in a different world altogether. The idea that we would be only 7% down is like an extremely exact and extremely stupid decision. That cannot be true, but that's how people think, by extrapolating lines and putting in small differences. That is not the right way to think about this. The right way to think about this is not, as you pull, does the rubber band get thinner? It does, until it snaps and you're in a different place. And that's actually, I think, the way to think about this problem. Can we keep it from snapping so that, in fact, we're just dealing with problems that we can adapt to, as opposed to moving us into places where we don't have the ability to adapt anymore?
That's very helpful to think about it that way. Those thresholds, rather than just trying to optimize a little number. I think one thing you also mentioned was this clean tech boom of the late 2000s and early 2010s. And I think that was in some ways a cautionary tale, right? Because a lot of venture money went in and it kind of busted, right? Like a lot of those investments kind of went bust. And I think you shared a little bit why you think that now is a great time. And there's a lot of people that are interested in climate tech. But I'm curious if there's other things that make you feel like this is a different time and more optimistic about this climate tech boom.
Well, I think the other thing I think the right way to think about this is outside the range of Wall Street or Silicon Valley or the people in this room. I think the right way to think about this is huge societal challenge. Society has to decide to solve it. It won't get solved in a few back rooms with a few venture capitalists or a few entrepreneurs or some people from Wall Street. It will get solved because people decide as a group we have to solve it, and it becomes something that is part of everybody's thinking. And I'll give you the example of how I would think about it differently from the way I think people are thinking about it. And that in 1996, I was talking to a friend of mine from high school who lives out here and who's I think, very smart guy. And I asked him about the internet companies, which were like in those days, eBay and, some of the early companies. And he goes, really, the internet companies. Let me ask you a question. Do you use electricity to turn on the lights in your office? And I said, yeah. And he goes, so do you think of yourself as an electricity company? And I go, no. And he said, well, stop thinking about them as internet companies. Think of the internet as a tool to deliver goods and services in a new way. And if people can deliver goods and services in a new way, then they're going to be incredibly popular. They're not selling the internet, they're selling goods and services. And if you think about it, everybody's an internet company now. There is no internet company. There are people using online capability to deliver goods and services that other people want. And so if you think about what we're going to do as a society, everybody is going to have to be a climate company, just like everybody has to be an internet company. Because pervasively, if we don't do that, we're going to be screwed. And so, we're going to have to, this is going to get woven into the fabric of car companies, but every company is going to have to look at their footprint. Every company is going to have to think about this. It's going to be part of life, or we're going to have, we're not going to solve it. And so as a society, we're going to have to decide. If you think back to 1800, people were a lot fewer and a lot poorer everywhere in the globe. And since then, we have basically progressed in so many ways. People live longer, they're healthier, they're better educated, they're richer, there are a million problems, but progress has been pretty constant, pretty much everywhere. Not that we're there, but it's been pretty constant, except for one thing, we've burned up a lot of the planet to do it. And we can't do that anymore. And I think we can continue to progress as a globe, as the people of the globe, but we can't continue to destroy the planet as we do. And that's the challenge, because if we can do this in the right way, then people's health can continue to get better, people's education, we can be more just, it can be more fair, people can live longer and have better lives, but not if we destroy the planet along the way. So I view it as like, this is a limiting factor for the continued advancement that is incredibly exciting of human beings, but also the other species on the planet. Because I think it's impossible to think about this issue without thinking about extinction and what we're doing more broadly in terms of the natural world. We live in a natural world even though we forget it. And if we burn that up, we're going to have unlimited human suffering.
Back to unlimited human suffering.
Well, you got to, because I think people want this to be an intellectual idea from people who have PhDs, which I do not have. That is not what this is about. If you think about who's going to suffer the most first, look around the globe. It is some very, very poor people who basically have no carbon footprint and have emitted virtually no greenhouse gases. in the way that they've lived and the way that their parents lived and the way their grandparents have lived. But those are the people who are probably in harm's way in the most painful way. So I think it's really important to remember exactly why this is not a theoretical scientific problem, but very much of a human problem.
That makes sense. Going back to what you shared about every company will be a climate company. Recently, you did found Galvanize Climate Solutions, which focuses on climate tech companies. Could you speak a little bit more about the companies you're looking to invest in and the opportunities you see for companies going beyond the necessary climate footprint, but to actually, address some of the problems with climate change?
So what we've started is a company which is designed to come up with non-concessionary, which I would love to discuss with you guys, investment activities across a broad number of investment areas, all about decarbonization and climate solutions. One of those has to do with early stage companies and, changes in technology. But we see huge, if you think about it, just to step back for 1 second, the built environment is a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions. It is also something that we probably know what to do about. And it's not like we're not going to get better about it, but there are existing hundreds of millions of buildings around the world that need to be redone in terms of how they do heating and lighting and cooling. And that is something that we have to do. And so the question is, what is the investment activity that's going to let that happen? How are we going to get that done? We do, there are some big, huge new industries that need to be done, like green hydrogen, like sequestration. So there's, if you think there are these big pillars of gigantic, old-fashioned, you can touch it businesses that have to get redone. And the idea is, okay, how many different kinds of investment opportunities are there that are, every one of them has to be impactful in terms of climate solutions. And I'll give you an example. So if you think about public companies, now I was one of the people who felt like people with moral authority in society should be divesting from fossil fuel companies 10 years ago, because I felt like it's a statement, just like divesting from South African companies was a statement to say apartheid is not an acceptable way of running a country, that you are saying that is wrong, and we're making a moral statement, not an economic statement. But today, if you think about actually solving this problem, a lot of decarbonization has to come from companies that are emitting greenhouse gases, that are carbonizing. And so there's a real question here from an investment standpoint. Okay, is your job to steer clear and keep your skirts clean? Or is your job to work to make sure that the companies that are causing this problem, take a different tack? And so in all these things, I have about 25 different ideas in terms of investment, in terms of how we can push to get things to move faster globally and actually solve this problem in a way that makes money and makes investors happy and has impact.
I think a lot of folks who are looking for startup ideas should listen to you and figure out what those are. Actually, a lot of the folks here are, technical, digital, and kind of, I think there's this conception that, if you're interested in climate justice or interested in climate tech, you're either exactly what you said, a PhD in, some climate energy tooling, whether it's wind turbines or solar, or you're a policymaker. And I think a lot of folks in Silicon Valley are really passionate about climate, but are trying to figure out kind of how to find a wedge to be able to make an impact. Could you speak to the role of software and you're laughing.
Look, there's an old, I don't know if it's a cliche or a truism about for life, which is if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And as I like to say to people, what is the greenhouse gas content of your sweater? Nobody knows. There is such little awareness and measurement across so much of this world and so many of these industries that how are you actually going to change behavior if you don't really know what's going on in the first place? So in terms of software, there's so much measurement that's necessary. There's so much sensing that is necessary. There is an ability to, if you're going to have systems to charge for emissions and pay for sequestration to the tune of $1 trillion a year, it would be very nice if you could measure it, because otherwise how everyone's going to be claiming they're sequestering and not emitting anything. So there's a gigantic role for information and data here that does not exist, that absolutely has to exist, and it has to exist in a way that is affordable. So I think, oh my God, there's so many different ways that measurement is going to have to be done. I mean, I was literally this morning reading about, I think 25% of the greenhouse gas emissions in terms of impact every year come from methane. And people basically have felt like methane is about leakage from the natural gas system, kind of from the wellhead to delivery. And it turns out that there is now better satellite mapping of methane emissions, that they had no idea how much of it was coming from landfills around the world. And that in fact, so how are you going to solve the problem if you don't know where the emissions are coming from? How are we going to sequester carbon through agriculture if in fact we can't measure how much carbon is being sequestered and therefore pay people to do it around the world? And can we really afford, which I promise you we can't, to send everybody to every acre once a year to find out what the carbon content of the soil is? That can't happen from a cost standpoint. So the question is, how are we really going to do that? There's an immense need in my mind for, technical stuff in so many different places. And it isn't necessarily the things you think of, which are the big physical systems, big wind turbines, solar arrays, EVs. In my mind, that an awful lot of this solution is going to come with a 21st century answer, which is known as information, data, and software. And that if we can get that information in an accurate, timely way to people who are running big systems, then they can figure out how to make it better. And if we can't, I could take it, oh my God, I think people dramatically misunderstand the impact here of information. In the 21st century, it's sort of funny, but it's really true.
Beyond data gathering, is there anything else that tech or software engineering can do to...
Tech? Oh my God. Yes.
Tech meaning software.
Well, God, I think all this stuff is, if you think about batteries, people talk a lot about batteries and, they think about the different batteries for the different needs. But actually, the software managing those batteries is actually going to have a huge amount to do with how they work. And the battery management systems are way underestimated. But I'll give you an example of a company that we're not invested in, so I'm not, but which, I don't know how much time you guys have spent in the waste industry, but basically the way that recycling gets done is they put all the garbage on a conveyor belt and human beings pick it out. Generally considered to be maybe the worst job in America. You're indoors, you're picking garbage, it never stops. And this can't be true, but I was told that the median time for someone to hold that job, the duration that they actually continue to do that job is 2 weeks. It is a truly terrible job. It is also, if you think about it, can you really believe that's how we're doing it? And so some really smart person who has a big robotics background from Caltech has come up with a much faster, much cheaper way to pick through garbage and put it together with a visual recognition technology that can pick up 10,000 SKUs. And if you think about what should be happening in the world, that is a much, much, much smarter way to do something. And this is about climate, because you may or may not have read probably 2 months ago that 6% of the plastic gets recycled. I think everybody thought it was at least 50% in California, but it isn't. It's 6. And so if you think about what that means from a greenhouse gas and a fossil fuel standpoint, that's a big deal. So is that tech? Yes. There's so much stuff and that guy literally went to Caltech. He is one of the leading robotics people in the world. And he said, what can I do for climate? What is my skill? How is that applicable to try and answer this question, this big problem? And he spent a lot of time thinking about it and trying to think, okay, this is what I know how to do. This is how I can make a change. I'm going to build a company around it.
That makes sense. Speaking of, companies you've invested in or not invested in, I think one of the companies you invested in was Regrow Ag, which is kind of thinking a little bit about how to measure the improvement in sustainable farming techniques and create carbon offset credits as a result. And I'm curious less about that company in particular, but more about the carbon offset movement in general and kind of what your thoughts are on these marketplaces, because there have been quite a lot of criticism of them as well.
Tons. So let's just go through what offsets are first before we talk about how to think about them. So basically the idea is if you are emitting carbon, you can basically buy an offset, the sequestration of carbon, so that you are basically net neutral. And to put that in an even broader standpoint, if you think about where we're going, all these companies and all these countries are promising to be net neutral, net zero, by 2050 or 2045. That doesn't mean they're not emitting greenhouse gases. It means that they're sequestering as many greenhouse gases as they're emitting. So it's net zero. And to put that in context, if you think about how much is being emitted now and how much they think they're going to have to sequester, people estimate now just 42 gigatons of carbon every year. And they think that by 2050, in order to be at net zero as a planet, we're going to have to be sequestering 10 gigatons, just to put it in context. So we will have reduced by 75%, but the other 25% is really hard to get rid of. And so in order for us to be net neutral, we're going to have to sequester 10. Those are the numbers. Offsets are basically either because the government requires it, or because you, from a moral standpoint, want to, or you want to please your customers, or you want to please your employees, you want to be net zero. So you buy an offset, you continue to emit. So here's the issue with offsets. First of all, a lot of them don't work. And the estimates have been, the simplest answer would be, okay, you're paying somebody your offset is you're going to grow trees. And the trees are going to suck carbon out of the air and put it in the tree. And then the trees burn down, as they have in California. So there you have an offset that didn't quite offset. And the estimates on how many of the offsets have been bullshit is up to 85%, just to be clear. So it's not like on the margin, there's 1 or 2% that kind of fell out. People, a lot, and some of the people who have been big sellers of offsets have been people who have either, because they actually thought they were doing the right thing, have said, mea culpa, didn't really work, I apologize. I'm not sure they gave the money back, but they apologized. But then, so here's something I do believe happened. You can get an offset for not cutting down your trees, okay? So the idea is, maybe you were planning to cut down your trees. Maybe you weren't planning to cut down your trees. So one of the people, which I don't know, I'm sure you guys are all members, especially the women are members of the Bohemian Grove, they got paid $2 million not to cut down their trees for last year. What do you think the chances are that something called the Bohemian Grove was going to cut down their trees? I would go with 0. But somehow they managed to scam $2 million for it in an offset. My point being, so when we think about offsets, the first question is, does it mean anything? Is it going to last? Is it differential? Is it additional? Or is it something you're paying someone to do something that they were going to do anyway? Is there a lot of leakage? Does some of it burn down? So the real question is, how good is it? But then the second question is, if you buy an offset, you're getting permission to continue to pollute. So there is a question about, first of all, does the offset mean anything? But the second question is about the pollution itself. And a lot of people are pissed for the following reason. Pollution around greenhouse gases has a very high correlation with other kinds of pollution, which is air pollution and water pollution. Toxicity, things that make people sick right now. And so if you're thinking about a problem which involves unlimited human suffering in the future, it doesn't seem appropriate to forget human suffering right now. So a lot of the people who are talking about who are upset about offsets are saying, yeah, you're going to offset the greenhouse gases by doing something 14,000 miles away, but you're going to continue to let these people pollute our air and water today in our neighborhood. So your offset solves one problem, but it doesn't solve our problem. And if you listen to the reaction to the Inflation Reduction Act, and I don't know how closely you followed it, there have been a bunch of environmental justice organizations who are basically going, bullshit, man, bullshit. You guys sold us out in terms of allowing a bunch of continued old-fashioned polluting activities to go on. So when you think about offsets, you have to be asking yourself all of these questions. But you also have to have in the back of your mind, if we're getting to net zero, it's net zero. So we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we're also going to have to sequester. But if you don't take into account the impacts today of what you're doing and what you're allowing, then my attitude has always been, if you don't have environmental justice up front when you start, you're going to get the wrong answer. That has got to be part of the calculation, part of the leadership from the very beginning, or you'll end up in the wrong place. And that's true in the United States. If you think about California, we've always had the dirty parts of our economy put in low income, poorly politically organized communities. So that if you think, I'll give you a quick example and then I want to talk about the globe, but West Fresno is 2 miles from North Fresno. West Fresno is a really poor part of Fresno. I think they have a 22-year lower life expectancy than North Fresno. And if you go there, you can see why. There is toxicity there that gets people to die really early. And so when the people talk about environmental justice, it's not some theoretical thing that they read in a textbook. It's the life they're living and their kids are living right now. So it's a super important thing to be dealing with. And if you think about the world, it's environmental justice writ large. Because if we go to India, which is kind of the poster child for this, they're saying, you don't want us to burn coal. We didn't cause this problem. We are a fraction as rich as you. Our greenhouse gas profile per capita is a fraction of yours. And we're the problem? Really? You want us not to develop, and you want to continue to emit greenhouse gases at many multiples of what we're doing? Come on. How could that be fair? That is going to be a huge issue globally, and it's a huge issue today. And unless we deal with that up front, that is going to be something which is going to be an overwhelming problem for coming up with global solutions. That's not complicated. That's just the truth.
That makes sense. So it seems like I have one more question to ask. I would love to ask so many more questions, including where the plaid tie is. But instead of that, I'll ask one more question and then we'll turn off the camera for an. I
don't wear a tie very much anymore.
Perks of no longer being a politician. We're running for. So we'll turn off the camera then and pivot to audience questions. But I think you touched on the Inflation Reduction Act, and I'm curious from the lens of being a climate activist, kind of what you thought of the Inflation Reduction Act, particularly how its evolution from the Build Back Better, Build Back Better plan, and then also kind of what the future looks like for climate justice in the US, and then also globally as we think about multilateral policy.
Just writing down that
Yeah,
three-part question.
Trying to pack it in one question.
Okay. In terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, look, what the Inflation Reduction Act, I mean, obviously that's a political name for this. In terms of the climate part of this, it is better than I was expecting from the Build Back Better. So, I think it's really important to recognize that this is something that's done through reconciliation. I'm sure you guys all know that. And it means that there can't be any rules in it. Reconciliation has to be about the budget. So it has to be about money. So you cannot have rules put in the way, and when you think about how we're going to legislate about this, the idea of doing it without rules and doing it only with money is probably not optimal, honestly. But given that we were at most going to get 50 votes and it takes 60 votes to pass rules, then given where we were, this is honestly better than I would have expected. And kind of the day before it happened, I was expecting a big fat nothing. So I'm pretty excited about the climate part of this. I think it's also true that if you look at Build Back Better, it was a very broad bill. And it included an awful lot of things about justice and poverty and, trying to build a different kind of society. And almost all of that got cut out. Not 100% of it, but the vast bulk of it. And that was a choice. And, we could talk about that for a long time. I did talk to someone today who I consider to be, one of the true most thoughtful, smartest people on this topic, which is a guy from North Carolina named Bishop William Barber, who I consider to be just an incredibly brilliant thinker on this topic. And his basic point was, this is the beginning, not the end. And that we have to keep going on the rest of this. So that's that's really where I come out on the Inflation Reduction Act. In terms of climate justice in the United States, look, I think it is incredibly significant that every single Democrat voted for this bill and absolutely no Republican voted for this bill. And it's kind of like, I can tell you, I've been working on this for 12 to 15 years, and I cannot tell you how many times Republicans have told me, we're really serious about this, we take this seriously, we know the science, but not one voted for it, and that's out of more than 250. So when we think about environmental justice and the ability to get something done really broadly beyond the money, I don't even know how to think about that anymore. And if you think about the voting for Brett Kavanaugh, people in the Republican Party said a lot of things about caring about choice and women's right to an abortion and abortion is healthcare and blah, 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 but no one didn't vote for Brett Kavanaugh. So we're in a really strange situation from my standpoint in the United States because talk is cheap. And ultimately, I think the vast bulk of Americans want climate action because, no one wants unlimited human suffering. At least they don't in their neighborhood. And everybody's neighborhood is vulnerable. You look across the places that are deep red states, it's like, oh my God. You would think that they would be, how do you miss it? They're super vulnerable. Florida, super vulnerable. Texas, super vulnerable. So I don't know what will change that. I can speculate about it, but I hope that the thing that changes that is not a disaster, I will say. I truly hope that that is something where people decide it's important enough that they're gonna break the sort of partisan divide because it's important for them and the people that they love. But I'm shocked, honestly, that we are where we are. I always thought this was a nonpartisan issue for everybody to get behind, regardless of party or income level or any other geography or any of the things that divide us. In terms of the international stuff, it is really going to be hard, in my opinion, because I think if you look at the desire of Southern Hemisphere countries to be compensated for the cost of developing in a different way, and you look at the reluctance of Northern Hemisphere companies for paying for that, it's kind of a rock and a hard place. And, you know, it's been something which has been a huge cause of consternation internationally. It continues to be. I mean, I don't know how closely you guys follow this, but the worse this gets, the angrier people are going to be. And I think that if you look at the temperatures in Southern Asia, and you look at the water conditions in Southern Asia, and you look, it's, you know, it's just, in my mind, the problem maybe will be severe enough that it forces everybody to compromise and to come to a solution. But I can tell you that I've done a reasonable number of conversations with people from South Asia, and there's a lot of emotion here. And, you know, you can sit there and go like, wow, that makes a ton of sense. But I mean, if you then think about the United States Congress, how much they're going to allocate, because how much are they going to allocate to people outside the United States from American taxpayers' dollars? So I think that's a fundamental justice problem. I have some ideas about how to cross that divide. And, you know, let me say one last thing, and then before you just start asking questions. Look, I don't know how all of you guys feel about capitalism, but let me make one point about capitalism. Capitalism scales. If you have something that works in business, you can make it really big. You can make it global. You can take it everywhere. And so when you think about how to solve a huge problem, you need something that scales. And, you know, I think there's a sense of like, this is something where philanthropy is going to solve this. We're going to have philanthropy. That's going to solve this. Here's something that doesn't scale: philanthropy. And it's just, you know, I was talking to a guy who runs the biggest lab at Stanford. So he's a materials science professor, super smart guy. His lab is the biggest lab at Stanford, $4 million a year. He invented a new battery that raised $250 million. And he was like, whoa, capitalism. Like, yeah. If you can invent something that really works economically, it scales. And that's something we need. And that's why I'm doing Galvanize Climate Solutions. Because if we can come up with these things that really scale, that there's a value proposition. It's like, it's cheaper to pick through garbage with robots. You know, it's cheaper to do solar panels than to do, have you guys followed the price of natural gas? For all those people who are saying natural gas is so cheap, it's like, actually not so cheap. It's not cheap at all. It's gone from $2 to $9. So capitalism scales. And that's why I'm so interested in these solutions that are non-concessionary. Because if you can get there, then you can really blow it out. And there's money to do it. And that's really what we need, is to get that. And that's why tech is so important. It's like, we all know in California, we can drive down the costs. We can drive up the productivity. We can make things better every year. We can beat the burning rocks. That's where we're going.
I like that we ended on a note of optimism. I thought we were going to end it with the bleak part.
No, hell no. Oh, come on. No, this is a huge challenge. But you know what? we're on the planet for a reason. Who wants to live in a time where there's no huge challenges? This is a huge, big-ass challenge. Great. We can definitely do this. But it's gonna be an effort.